Hello, good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever in the world you are. The SADC election observer mission to Zimbabwe report is finally out. It is interesting reading. The report itself is, I believe, as detailed as the preliminary report. I think it will be good to start with SADC's reports in the past. SADC's reports in the past have always said the election process was substantially free, fair, and credible, which has always been interpreted as they are legal. The result is legal. This time, 2023, was completely different because instead of following that standard line, the SADC preliminary report clearly stated that the process itself had failed to meet Zimbabwe's election standards and the regional body's own election guidelines. The final report, I believe, says exactly the same thing. This is what it says, and I think the most important bit is this section 13.3. The SADC election observer mission noted, this is in its conclusion, as detailed in section 6 and 7 of this report, some aspects of the harmonized elections fell short of the requirements of the Constitution of Zimbabwe, the Electoral Act, and the SADC principles and guidelines governing democratic elections. And it stops there. What is most important here to note is that if you go to those sections 6 and 7, they spell out those aspects that failed to meet the requirements of the Zimbabwe Constitution or Electoral Act or SADC's principles and guidelines, as detailed in the preliminary report. What the preliminary report, or what Dr. Nevas Mumba said in his preliminary report, was a bit more explicit. That those failures, the consequences of that was that the election itself could not be judged as free, fair, and credible. This final report does not say that. This is interesting in the sense that if we were to look at, for instance, the European Union 2018 election observer mission report, it goes through the various aspects of the election process, pointing out the shortcomings and the irregularities and the illegalities and so forth and so on. And this punchline is, as such, main aspects of the 2018 elections in Zimbabwe failed to meet the international standard. This is exactly following the same lines as we are seeing here in the SADC 2023 election report. So the election report itself says Zimbabwe's 2023 elections failed, fell short of the requirements of the Constitution of Zimbabwe, the Electoral Act, and SADC's principles and guidelines governing democratic elections. It is not for the SADC report to say, therefore, then the elections were illegitimate. I think they are basically saying the same thing which SADC was saying. But it is a completely total departure from the usual, they were substantially free, fair, and credible. I think that is the subtle difference. Already, there are some apologists, like Professor Jonathan Moyo, who have already concluded that this is the report is therefore then endorsing the election results, and it should be the end of it. It does not say there should be fresh elections or a national transition authority. Well, that is his interpretation. In fact, even after reading the preliminary report, Dr. Mumba never said that there should be fresh elections or a national transition authority or a government of national unity. He never said that because it wasn't in his mandate to say that. But what he was saying there is it failed to meet those requirements. It fell short. And if it fell short, surely the process itself is flawed. The result cannot be considered to be legal. I mean, just to pick one item from section 6, they give the same detail as they gave in fact, a bit more detail than they gave in the preliminary report, because this final report goes into about 31 pages. And basically, what he's saying regarding the voters' roll, for instance, is that ZEC failed to produce a verified voters' roll. The contestants did not get a copy of a voters' roll that they could verify, which is a requirement of the Zimbabwe Constitution and the Electoral Act. If you did not have a verified voters' roll, it is inconceivable how you can seriously say the election or the result is a reflection of the democratic will of the people, when so many of the people, because you didn't have a verified voters' roll, were denied the opportunity to vote. If you had produced the verified voters' roll, people would have been able to say, I am not in the voters' roll, and they would have been added in. Or those who were in the voters' roll would have been able to inspect it and realize, oh, I'm not supposed to be voting in this polling station, but another polling station. But because he never gave them that time, they turned up at polling station A and find their name is not there. And so they were denied the vote. I think the final report, although it lacked the punchline that the election process was flawed and illegal, it still says the same thing as the preliminary report. That the process failed to meet Zimbabwe's Constitution, Electoral Act, SADC's own principles and guidelines on governing democratic elections. So SADC cannot, in all honesty, pretend that the result could possibly be legal. I think SADC owe it to the people of Zimbabwe to hold their extraordinary summit and declare the process, the Zimbabwe election of August 2023, flawed. That cannot be denied. The fact that it did not contain the punchline is neither here or there. I think SADC election observer teams in the past have been even more careful in their language, very diplomatic. In fact, in this particular case, we're lying because you cannot say substantially free, fair, and credible when the elections were flawed and illegal. Just as this year's elections were flawed and illegal. We will have to wait and see. But in my personal view, is that the the report still does not say these elections were free, fair, and credible, or could possibly be free, fair, and credible. It does not. It clearly says it fell short of Zimbabwe's constitution, Zimbabwe's Electoral Act, and SADC's own principles and guidelines. So how can we say the result is then valid? I don't think we can say that in all honesty. But my fear is that SADC leaders will use that as the excuse to endorse ZANU-PF as legitimate. South Africa particularly has been itching to do that. It is no secret that South Africa particularly did not want to see regime change in Zimbabwe. And even if that meant ZANU-PF rigging the elections, the elections were rigged. The election process, everything could not have produced the democratic will of the people of Zimbabwe. It did not. Those violation of the Electoral Act, the Constitution, and so forth are so serious that you cannot pretend they did not have an effect on the outcome. This is not like a situation where you're saying, well, okay, a few hundred people were denied the vote. But, what is a few hundred compared to 4 million people who voted? What we are saying here is that the voters' roll, for instance, was so flawed that you cannot really verify anything. We don't know who voted. We don't know who were denied the vote. It's so blatant and it's so serious and so widespread that you cannot deny that the process is flawed and illegal. How can a flawed process, the illegal process, produce a legitimate result? Cannot. That is the argument. It is interesting to note that ZANU-PF and the apologists, including Professor Jonathan Moyo, whom I have referred to earlier on, were up in arms when the preliminary report was produced. I think right now they are celebrating that the final report was not so as punchy as the preliminary report. They must be sitting there with their fingers crossed that SADC, heads of state, will decide to sweep the whole thing under the carpet. There's been reports that there's going to be an extraordinary SADC meeting in Tanzania on the 31st of this month. One hopes that that will still go ahead. Whether or not it will, we'll have to wait and see. That was just some information that was circulating on the social media 2 days ago. I believe this report is still as valid and condemning as what we are likely to see from the AU itself and what we are likely to see from the European Union, the Commonwealth, and all the other teams that observed these elections. Yes, the SADC report does not have the punchline. This election process was flawed and illegitimate, and the result cannot be legitimate. Or to put it in the same language as the European Union did regarding the 2018 election, the process failed to meet international standards. That phrase, as far as the European Union is concerned, clearly meant they did not recognize those elections as free, fair, and credible. And ZANU-PF never referred to that report. But they would want to pretend that they can use the SADC report and pretend they have endorsed those elections as they've done in the past, substantially free, fair, and credible. The SADC report does not say that. And it's been very careful not to say that. I believe the conclusion is very clear. 13.3 of the report is very clear. These elections have failed to meet Zimbabwe's own election standards, constitution, electoral act, and SADC's own principles and guidelines on democratic elections. They failed. And if they failed, how can you still say that the result is valid? There are some people who would want to make us believe that the election is still valid. It is not. I think if SADC were to sweep this report under the carpet, they would have betrayed the SADC election observer team, particularly Dr. Nevas Mumba, who has been subjected to all kinds of abuse by the ZANU-PF regime and its apologists because he presented that report. But most significantly, they would have betrayed the ordinary Zimbabweans who have lived under this tyrannical regime for the last 43 years and were looking at this opportunity as a chance to clear the deck, appoint a government of national unity with a national transition authority composed of competent men and women who will, above all else, implement the democratic reforms to get Zimbabwe back on the democratic track. Without reforms, I think we can spend the next 100 years, 200 years, we will still be talking about Zimbabwe failure to hold free and fair and credible elections. Zimbabwe will still be having one mediocre government after another. The present political system is totally incapable of producing quality leaders across the political divide, be they in ZANU-PF or in CCC. In ZANU-PF, the country would not be in the mess we are in if those leaders were competent. I think that speaks for itself. And CCC, well, they had the golden chance to implement the democratic reforms during the GNU. They failed to implement even one meaningful reform. And look what is happening in the party right now. 15 of the 100 or so members of parliament of CCC have been recalled because of the chaos within the party. As much as Chamisa would like to blame it on ZANU-PF, the truth of the matter is the chaos was of his own making. He didn't want a constitution. He didn't want the party to have a structure. He didn't want properly elected officials in that party. He wanted to control everything. And because there's no constitution, there's no structure, there's nothing, anyone can come up and say, oh, I've got the power to do A, B, C, D, which is what one of the members have done. And has written to the Speaker of the House saying that 15 of those MPs have been recalled. And the Speaker of the House of Parliament has since acted on it and recalled 15. The issue gets even more interesting because Chamisa has produced for public consumption a letter dated the 11th of September in which he was instructing the Speaker of the House that the only person who can recall any of the elected CCC members was himself. The Speaker of the House has since said he received a letter from Chamisa on the 5th of October. So the letter, according to Chamisa, was written 11th of September, was not received until 5th of October. It does not take that long for letters to travel or couriers to pick a letter from Chamisa's office to deliver to Parliament. They are both in Harare. So the question then is Chamisa trying to be smart by pretending the letter was written on the 11th when it wasn't? Or if it was written on the 11th, the most important thing is when did he send it to the Speaker of Parliament? If he received it on the 5th of October, somebody somewhere is lying. But now the challenge is actually on Chamisa to produce a letter with the stamp or proof that he delivered that 11th of September letter long before the 5th of October. But regardless, even if he was to produce that, the truth of the matter is this chaos was caused by the failure by Triple C to have a proper constitution in which members of office bearers have their duties and powers spelled out. He himself was self-appointed president, and he appointed those around him. There was no election of any kind to fill those positions. So it is really difficult to say Triple C who is authorized to do what. This is a problem of his own making. And typical of Triple C, he wants to blame on somebody else, just like ZANU-PF. It's always in the habit of blaming everybody else except themselves. This carry-on cannot continue. This is why it is important that SADC reject the election that took place on the 23rd of August as a flawed process and illegitimate, and the result cannot be legal. This will clear the deck and allow SADC, hopefully with the help of the UN, to appoint men and women whose primary task would be to implement the democratic reforms and organize fresh elections. I believe that by implementing the democratic reforms, Zimbabwe will give itself a chance to have quality leaders emerge. I believe quality leaders will emerge if you implement the democratic reforms. At the present moment, the political system is like a sewage pond. You'll never get quality fish from that. Implement the democratic reforms, allow a debate and democratic discourse, the space to operate. I think in the time it takes to implement the democratic reforms, you will see quality political parties emerging. And by the time fresh elections are held, I believe there will be quality leaders for the nation to choose from. Put the country on the democratic track, and there is hope of Zimbabwe's economic and political recovery. As it is now, there is none. I still argue that SADC leaders must seriously look at this report and come to the right conclusion. If the process failed to meet Zimbabwe's own constitutional requirements, its own electoral acts, failed to meet SADC's own principles and guidelines on democratic elections, how can we still say the result is legitimate? The report does not say give that punchline, but it is not for that report to give that punchline. SADC leaders themselves must come to that conclusion for themselves. Just as much as the European Union in 2018 spelled out how the process itself was so flawed, so illegal, it could not produce a legitimate result. Their punchline was the election process failed to meet international standards. If you fail to meet international standards, you failed. You can't pretend you failed to meet international standards and you still have passed. No, you didn't. You can't pretend that the election process in Zimbabwe 2023 failed to meet Zimbabwe's own constitutional demands, its own electoral act, failed to meet the principles and guidelines of SADC's election process, and still produce a legitimate result. That is nonsensical. Therefore, I call upon again SADC leaders to look at this report and do the right thing. I think if they sweep this report under the carpet, they would have betrayed the people of Zimbabwe. The people of Zimbabwe are desperate for change. After 43 years of rigged elections and tyrannical rule, the country is a failed state. Millions of Zimbabweans have been forced to leave the country as economic or political refugees. And those who have remained in the country, millions of them are living in abject poverty. The prospect of another 5 years of this corrupt and tyrannical regime is unthinkable. No. The SADC report, final report, is as clear as the preliminary report. SADC leaders must read it and act accordingly. That is the right thing to do. Thank you very much for listening, and good night. Oh, just got a comment here. Maybe I should I'll read this comment before we close. This is Mufumi. We've always said CCC is still MDC and is just the other side of the ZANU-PF coin, corrupt, toxic, and dictatorial. Well, I couldn't agree with you more. But like I said, I believe one of the reasons why that is the case is because the present political system will never produce quality leaders. You have to be a thug to survive in the present political atmosphere in Zimbabwe. And therefore then, yes, you've ended up with thugs on both ZANU-PF side and CCC side. The infighting in CCC for power, for positions, is as relentless as the infighting in ZANU-PF itself. The only reason why ZANU-PF has been able to retain some modicum of order is that as the incumbent government, the regime is able to reward a number of party faithfuls and therefore then keep discipline. If Mnangagwa was to lose power, just as what happened to Robert Mugabe in 2017, the minute those ZANU-PF leaders realized that the winds of change, the political wind had shifted, Mugabe no longer had control. He himself must have been shocked to see how many of them switched sides and how quickly. That is the problem with our political system. There is no principles, just politics of the stomach, as somebody would argue. I've got maybe another comment from Mufumi. He's saying we need fresh and competent men and women to lead Zimbabwe and should exclude any from ZANU-PF and CCC. I could not agree with you more on that one as well. I think, to me, it is ridiculous that we should even bother try to include ZANU-PF or CCC, because to include ZANU-PF or CCC in the National Transition Authority, if we were to, SADC was to go that far, ZANU-PF will never reform itself out of office, because they know if the elections were free, fair, and credible, ZANU-PF will never win them. And so they would want to resist any meaningful reforms. And as for CCC, you've got to ask yourself, why did they fail to implement even one reform during the last GNU? The opportunity was there, 5 years, and they failed to implement even one token reform. It's because once they got into power, they were quite happy with that. They realized that they could, in fact, they believed, most of them believed they were now part of the ruling elite in Zimbabwe. And therefore then their position is secure. They don't need reforms. Not knowing that come the election, Mugabe decided that they didn't want MDC company. And so they rigged the elections, and they've just kept a sprinkling of opposition to give the impression that Zimbabwe is a healthy and functioning democratic country. And this is where this is why we are where we are. So again, to come back to the SADC report, I believe the SADC report is very clear. It does not contain the same punchline as Dr. Mumba delivered when he delivered the preliminary report. That I accept. But if you look at it, you read it, it is as clear as the preliminary report. The conclusion cannot be any clearer. The election process failed to meet Zimbabwe's own constitution and the Electoral Act. And it failed to meet the SADC principles and guidelines on free and fair elections. If it failed to meet those standards, how can we still say the process is legitimate? It cannot be. It was not a sudden departure from the usual SADC conclusion. This election process was substantially free, fair, and credible. No. I think SADC knew what they were saying here. These elections were not substantially free, fair, and credible. They were not. And they clearly state that in the conclusion. And I think SADC leaders would be letting the people of Zimbabwe down if they pretended otherwise. The report is a valid report, and it condemns the electoral process that took place on the 23rd and 24th of August 2023. That point must be said and must be emphasized. And what do we expect? We expect SADC to honor it, SADC to stand by it, and SADC to deny ZANU-PF political legitimacy, so that Zimbabwe can have the chance to have a national transition authority that will finally implement the democratic reforms that will get the country back on the democratic footing. Thank you very much again for listening, and good night, everybody.